In the space between what happens to you and how you respond lies the entire quality of your life. Yet most people never realize this space exists. They believe their emotions are automatic reactions to external events, that anger is the inevitable response to frustration, that anxiety is the natural consequence of uncertainty, that despair follows naturally from disappointment. But what if that fundamental assumption about human nature is wrong? If you're returning to explore these depths with us, you know we don't offer surface-level solutions. If this is your first encounter with these ideas, consider subscribing. We dive into the most practical applications of ancient wisdom for modern challenges every week. Right now, somewhere in the world, two people are experiencing identical circumstances, perhaps losing a job, facing criticism, dealing with betrayal, or confronting unexpected change. One person is consumed by rage, paralyzed by fear, or crushed by despair. The other remains centered, clear-thinking, and capable of responding with wisdom rather than reaction. The external situation is the same. The internal experience is radically different. What creates this difference? The ancient philosophers discovered something revolutionary about human consciousness. Our emotions are not inevitable responses to events, but interpretations we place on events, and interpretations can be examined, questioned, and changed. This discovery has been confirmed by modern neuroscience and cognitive psychology, but it was first mapped out by thinkers who lived over 2,000 years ago. This isn't about suppressing emotions or pretending we don't feel what we feel. That path leads to psychological fragmentation and eventual breakdown. This is about understanding the mechanism by which emotions arise and learning to work with that mechanism consciously rather than being its unconscious victim. When chaos erupts in our external world, when deadlines collide, relationships fracture, health fails, finances crumble, or plans disintegrate, we face a fundamental choice that most people don't even realize they're making. We can either allow our emotional reactions to compound the chaos, creating internal storms that make wise response impossible, or we can use these moments as opportunities to practice the kind of emotional mastery that transforms us from victims of circumstance into conscious agents of our own experience. The first technique for maintaining emotional equilibrium in chaotic times is what we might call the pause of recognition, learning to identify the precise moment when an initial emotional impulse arises and creating space between that impulse and our response to it. This isn't about suppressing the emotion, it's about recognizing it before it overwhelms our capacity for conscious choice. Most emotional reactions happen so quickly that we don't notice the transition from stimulus to response. Someone criticizes us, and we immediately feel defensive. Traffic slows down, and we instantly become frustrated. A plan falls through, and we automatically feel disappointed. The emotion seems to arise simultaneously with the triggering event, but careful observation reveals that there's always a gap, sometimes just milliseconds, between the initial perception and the emotional interpretation. In that gap lies all our power. When we can recognize an emotion as it's forming rather than after it has already taken control of our thoughts and actions, we gain the ability to examine it, understand it, and choose how to respond to it. This recognition requires practice because our habitual patterns run so deeply that they feel automatic and inevitable. The ancient masters developed specific techniques for expanding this crucial gap. They learned to notice physical sensations that precede emotional reactions, the tightening in the chest that signals anger beginning to form, the quickening of the heartbeat that indicates anxiety starting to build, the heaviness that suggests sadness is emerging. By becoming aware of these early warning signs, they could intervene before emotions reached the point where rational thought becomes impossible. Modern neuroscience has revealed the biological basis for these observations. The amygdala, our brain's alarm system, can trigger fight or flight responses before information even reaches the prefrontal cortex where conscious reasoning occurs. But when we train ourselves to recognize these early signals, we can engage the prefrontal cortex quickly enough to maintain conscious control over our responses. This practice of emotional recognition isn't about becoming emotionally numb or detached from life. If anything, it makes us more emotionally intelligent and responsive because we're choosing our emotional responses based on wisdom rather than being driven by unconscious patterns. We can feel deeply while maintaining the capacity to think clearly and act wisely. The second technique involves what the philosophers called perspective expansion, deliberately stepping back from our immediate emotional experience to see it within a larger context. When we're caught in the grip of a strong emotion, our entire world seems to contract around that feeling. The thing we're angry about becomes the most important thing in the universe. The fear we're experiencing feels like the ultimate threat. The sadness we're carrying seems permanent and all-consuming. But emotions, like weather patterns, are temporary phenomena that arise and pass away. They feel permanent only when we're in the middle of them. When we can step back and see them from a broader perspective, we realize that every emotion we've ever experienced has eventually changed or dissolved, that every crisis we've survived has taught us something valuable, that every loss has made space for something new. This perspective expansion isn't about minimizing genuine difficulties or pretending that serious problems don't matter. It's about seeing current challenges in the context of our entire life story, recognizing patterns of resilience we've demonstrated before, and remembering that our current emotional state doesn't define our permanent identity or determine our future possibilities. The ancients practiced this by regularly contemplating the temporary nature of all phenomena, including their own emotional states. They would remind themselves that just as storms eventually clear and seasons change, emotional turbulence is also temporary. This wasn't philosophical abstraction. It was practical psychology designed to prevent them from making permanent decisions based on temporary feelings. When we practice perspective expansion regularly, we develop what might be called emotional resilience, the capacity to experience strong emotions without being overwhelmed by them, to acknowledge their presence without being controlled by them, to learn from them without being defined by them. How often do we make decisions we later regret because we were caught in the grip of temporary emotions that felt permanent in the moment? The third technique for emotional mastery centers on what the ancient philosophers called the discipline of judgment, learning to distinguish between events themselves and the interpretations we habitually attach to those events. This might be the most revolutionary insight in all of philosophy, the recognition that our emotional suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from what we tell ourselves about what happens to us. Consider two people stuck in the same traffic jam. One becomes increasingly agitated, viewing the delay as evidence that the universe is conspiring against them, that their day is ruined, that they're victims of incompetent city planning. The other uses the unexpected pause to practice breathing exercises, listen to educational content, or simply appreciate a few moments of forced stillness in an otherwise busy day. Same event, radically different emotional experiences. This isn't about positive thinking or forcing ourselves to see everything as good. It's about recognizing that most events are fundamentally neutral until we interpret them through the lens of our expectations, assumptions, and habitual ways of thinking. When we can separate what actually happened from the story we tell ourselves about what happened, we gain enormous power over our emotional responses. The philosophers developed a practice of examining their automatic interpretations with the same rigor a scientist might bring to analyzing experimental data. When something triggered a strong emotional response, they would ask themselves, what exactly happened? What story am I telling myself about what happened? Is that story necessarily true? Are there other equally valid ways to interpret this situation? This questioning process doesn't eliminate emotional responses, but it prevents us from being trapped by interpretations that increase our suffering unnecessarily. We might still feel disappointed when plans don't work out, but we don't have to add the extra layer of suffering that comes from deciding that this disappointment proves we're unlucky or that life is unfair. The discipline of judgment requires consistent practice because our interpretive habits are deeply ingrained and often unconscious. We've been telling ourselves certain stories about what various events mean for so long that these interpretations feel like objective reality rather than subjective choices. But with patient practice, we can learn to recognize when we're adding unnecessary suffering to unavoidable pain. One of the most powerful aspects of this practice is realizing how much control we actually have over our emotional experience. When we believe our emotions are direct reactions to external events, we feel like victims of circumstance. When we recognize that emotions arise from our interpretations of events, we realize that we have the power to influence our emotional experience by working with those interpretations consciously. This doesn't mean we can choose to feel however we want at any given moment. Emotional patterns that have been established over decades don't change overnight, but it does mean that we're not condemned to repeat the same emotional reactions forever. We can gradually reshape our interpretive habits and, consequently, our emotional responses. The fourth technique involves what we might call present moment anchoring, learning to ground ourselves in immediate physical reality when emotions threaten to overwhelm our capacity for clear thinking. Strong emotions often pull us either into anxious thoughts about the future or regretful thoughts about the past, disconnecting us from the only moment in which we actually have any power to act. When we're angry, we're usually replaying past events or imagining future confrontations. When we're anxious, we're projecting ourselves into imagined future scenarios. When we're depressed, we're often lost in regrets about the past or hopelessness about the future. In all these cases, we've temporarily abandoned the present moment where actual life is happening and where our power to respond wisely actually exists. Present moment anchoring involves using physical sensations to bring our attention back to what's actually happening right now rather than what we're thinking or feeling about what might happen or what did happen. This might involve focusing on the sensation of our feet on the ground, the rhythm of our breathing, the temperature of the air on our skin, or the sounds around us. This isn't escapism or denial of legitimate concerns about past or future. It's strategic, recognizing that we can only respond effectively to challenges from a state of present moment awareness. When we're lost in emotional reactions to imagined scenarios, we waste energy that could be used for constructive action and make decisions based on fantasy rather than reality. The ancient masters understood that the present moment is the only place where transformation is possible. The past cannot be changed, and the future remains uncertain, but right now we can choose how to breathe, how to stand, how to direct our attention, and how to respond to whatever is actually in front of us. These seemingly small choices, made consistently in present moment awareness, gradually reshape our entire experience of life. Present moment anchoring also helps us recognize that emotions, no matter how intense they feel, are temporary experiences arising and passing away within our awareness. When we're completely identified with an emotion, it feels like our entire reality. When we can step back into present moment awareness, we realize that we are the consciousness in which emotions arise, not the emotions themselves. This practice becomes especially powerful during crisis situations when emotions are running high and clear thinking is most essential. Instead of being swept away by panic, rage, or despair, we can use physical anchoring techniques to maintain enough stability to assess situations accurately and respond wisely rather than merely react automatically. The fifth and perhaps most transformative technique is what the philosophers called voluntary discomfort, the practice of deliberately exposing ourselves to minor difficulties and inconveniences when we're not in crisis, so that we develop resilience for handling major challenges when they inevitably arise. This isn't about seeking suffering for its own sake or believing that hardship is inherently virtuous. It's about recognizing that if we only practice emotional control when life is easy, we won't have the skills we need when life becomes difficult. Just as physical muscles grow stronger through resistance training, emotional resilience develops through gradually increasing our capacity to remain centered in the face of discomfort. Modern life tends to insulate us from many forms of minor discomfort that previous generations experienced regularly. We control our temperature, avoid physical exertion, eliminate waiting, and generally arrange our environment to minimize friction and inconvenience. While these comforts are pleasant, they can leave us emotionally unprepared for the inevitable moments when life doesn't cooperate with our preferences. Voluntary discomfort might involve deliberately taking cold showers, walking instead of driving when time permits, fasting occasionally, sleeping on the floor, practicing silence, or saying no to tempting but unnecessary purchases. The specific practices matter less than the principle, regularly choosing minor discomfort to build our capacity for handling major challenges. These practices work by gradually expanding our comfort zone and proving to ourselves that we can remain stable and functional even when circumstances aren't ideal. When we've practiced maintaining equanimity during voluntary minor discomfort, we're much more likely to remain centered during involuntary major difficulties. This technique also helps us recognize how much of our emotional reactivity comes from the habit of avoiding discomfort at all costs. When we're not afraid of feeling uncomfortable, we become much more capable of making decisions based on wisdom rather than comfort, pursuing goals that matter to us even when they require effort, and maintaining our principles even when it's inconvenient to do so. What would change in your life if you stopped being controlled by the need to avoid all discomfort? The integration of these 5 techniques creates what the ancient philosophers called inner citadel, a core of stability that remains unshaken regardless of external circumstances. This isn't a fortress built to keep the world out, but a foundation of strength that allows us to engage with the world more fully because we're not constantly defending ourselves against emotional overwhelm. When we can recognize emotions as they arise, expand our perspective beyond immediate reactions, examine our interpretations objectively, anchor ourselves in present moment reality, and maintain resilience through voluntary challenge, we develop what might be called emotional sovereignty, the freedom to choose our responses based on wisdom rather than being driven by unconscious patterns. This sovereignty doesn't eliminate emotional responses or make us invulnerable to pain. If anything, it makes us more sensitive to both our own experience and the experience of others because we're not numbing ourselves with denial or distraction. But it does free us from being victims of our own emotional reactivity. The development of emotional mastery is not a linear process. There will be days when these techniques feel effortless and natural, and other days when we forget to use them entirely and find ourselves caught in old patterns of reactivity. This variability isn't failure, it's part of the learning process. The ancient masters spoke of philosophy as a lifelong practice, not a destination to be reached. What matters is not perfect consistency, but persistent return to these practices whenever we remember them. Each time we pause to recognize an emotion, each time we step back to gain perspective, each time we question our automatic interpretations, each time we anchor ourselves in the present moment, each time we choose voluntary discomfort over habitual comfort, we strengthen our capacity for conscious response. The beautiful thing about these techniques is that they work together synergistically. Present moment awareness makes it easier to recognize emotions as they arise. Perspective expansion helps us examine our interpretations more objectively. Voluntary discomfort builds the resilience we need to use these techniques when we're under pressure. The discipline of judgment prevents us from adding unnecessary suffering to unavoidable difficulties. As these practices become more integrated into our way of being, we begin to notice changes that extend far beyond our ability to handle crisis situations. Our relationships improve because we're less reactive and more thoughtful in our responses to others. Our work becomes more effective because we're not wasting energy on emotional drama that doesn't serve any constructive purpose. Our decision-making improves because we're not being driven by temporary emotional states. Perhaps most importantly, we develop what the philosophers called inner freedom, liberation from the tyranny of our own emotional reactivity. We realize that while we cannot control what happens to us, we always retain the power to choose what happens within us. This choice is the most fundamental freedom we possess, and it can never be taken from us unless we give it away through unconscious reactivity. This inner freedom doesn't mean we become emotionally flat or disconnected from life. It means we become more emotionally intelligent and responsive rather than merely reactive. We can feel deeply while maintaining the capacity to think clearly. We can care passionately about outcomes while remaining equanimous about results we cannot control. The development of emotional mastery also reveals something profound about the nature of human consciousness. When we can observe our emotions arising and passing away without being completely identified with them, we begin to realize that we are not our emotions. We are the awareness in which emotions appear, the consciousness that experiences them, the observer that watches them come and go. This recognition fundamentally changes our relationship to emotional experience. Instead of being overwhelmed by emotions, we can experience them as temporary weather patterns moving through the sky of our consciousness. Instead of trying to suppress or escape from difficult emotions, we can allow them to be present while maintaining our essential stability. This doesn't mean we become passive observers of our own experience. It means we become conscious participants who can respond to emotional information wisely rather than being driven by it unconsciously. Emotions become valuable sources of information about what matters to us and what needs attention, rather than forces that control our behavior. The ancient masters discovered that this kind of emotional mastery is not just personally beneficial, it's socially transformative. When we're not constantly defending ourselves against our own emotional reactivity, we become more capable of responding to others with patience, understanding, and compassion. When we're not adding our own emotional chaos to already difficult situations, we become sources of stability that others can rely on. In a world that often feels increasingly chaotic and emotionally volatile, the cultivation of inner stability becomes not just a personal practice but a form of service to others. When we can remain centered in the midst of chaos, we create space for clearer thinking, more creative solutions, and more compassionate responses to shared challenges. The techniques we've explored are not just emergency measures to be used during crisis situations. They're daily practices that gradually transform our entire relationship to emotional experience. When we practice them consistently during calm periods, they become natural and automatic responses that we can access even during intense stress. Every difficult situation we encounter becomes an opportunity to practice these techniques and strengthen our emotional resilience. Every moment of chaos becomes a chance to demonstrate to ourselves that our inner stability doesn't depend on external circumstances aligning with our preferences. How might your relationships, your work, and your overall experience of life change if you were no longer at the mercy of your own emotional reactivity? As we develop mastery over our emotional responses, we begin to understand what the ancient philosophers meant when they spoke of true freedom. They weren't talking about political freedom or financial freedom or freedom from responsibility. They were describing something far more fundamental: freedom from being controlled by our own unconscious reactions to circumstances beyond our control. This inner freedom doesn't mean we stop caring about external outcomes or become indifferent to what happens in the world around us. If anything, it allows us to engage more effectively with external challenges because we're not wasting energy on internal struggles that serve no constructive purpose. When we're not fighting against our own emotional reactivity, we have more resources available for addressing actual problems. The cultivation of emotional mastery also reveals the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is an inevitable part of human existence. We will all face loss, disappointment, physical discomfort, and difficult circumstances. But suffering is often optional. It's the additional layer of emotional reactivity we add to unavoidable pain through our resistance to reality, our interpretations of what pain means about us or our future, and our attempts to escape from or control what cannot be controlled. When we can experience pain without adding unnecessary suffering, we discover that we're much more resilient than we previously imagined. We can endure significant difficulties with grace and even find meaning and growth in challenges that once would have overwhelmed us. This isn't about becoming stoical in the sense of being emotionally numb. It's about becoming wise enough to respond to life's difficulties with appropriate rather than excessive emotional reactions. The 5 techniques we've explored work together to create what might be called emotional intelligence in action. This isn't just the ability to understand emotions intellectually, but the practical skill of working with emotional energy constructively rather than being controlled by it destructively. Recognizing emotions as they arise prevents them from building to overwhelming intensity before we're aware of them. Expanding our perspective prevents us from being trapped in narrow interpretations that increase suffering unnecessarily. Examining our judgments prevents us from adding fictional elements to real situations. Anchoring in the present moment prevents us from being lost in anxious or regretful fantasies. Practicing voluntary discomfort builds the resilience we need to use these techniques when they matter most. Together, these practices gradually transform our entire relationship to emotional experience. Instead of seeing emotions as forces that happen to us, we begin to understand them as information that arises within us, information that can be valuable if we know how to interpret it wisely, but that doesn't need to control our choices or define our identity. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without consistent practice. The patterns of emotional reactivity that most of us have developed over decades don't dissolve simply because we understand them intellectually. They require patient, persistent work to unravel and replace with more conscious patterns. But the effort is worth it because the alternative, remaining at the mercy of our own emotional reactivity, ultimately leads to a life of constant internal struggle and diminished effectiveness in dealing with external challenges. When we're constantly fighting against our own emotional responses, we have little energy left for creating positive change in our relationships, our work, or our communities. The ancient masters understood that emotional mastery is not a luxury for people who have already solved all their practical problems. It's a necessity for anyone who wants to respond to practical problems effectively. When our emotional reactions are proportionate to actual circumstances rather than amplified by unconscious fears and interpretations, we can assess situations more accurately and develop more creative solutions. This practical effectiveness extends to every area of life. In relationships, emotional mastery allows us to respond to conflicts with patience and wisdom rather than defensiveness and reactivity. In work, it enables us to handle pressure and setbacks without losing our capacity for clear thinking and collaborative problem solving. In parenting, it models for children how to handle life's inevitable difficulties with grace and resilience. Perhaps most importantly, emotional mastery frees us to pursue what truly matters to us without being deterred by temporary discomfort or social disapproval. When we're not afraid of feeling uncomfortable emotions, we become capable of making choices based on our deepest values rather than our immediate preferences or fears. This freedom extends to our relationships with others as well. When we're not constantly managing our own emotional reactivity, we become more available to offer genuine support and understanding to people who are struggling. We can listen without becoming emotionally overwhelmed ourselves. We can offer perspective without being preachy or dismissive. We can provide stability without being rigid or controlling. The ripple effects of this inner transformation extend far beyond our personal experience. Families become more harmonious when parents model emotional wisdom rather than emotional reactivity. Workplaces become more productive when colleagues can disagree without creating drama. Communities become more resilient when members can handle difficulties without scapegoating or panic. In a world that often seems to reward emotional reactivity, where the loudest, most dramatic responses get the most attention, the choice to develop emotional mastery can feel countercultural. But the ancient philosophers understood that lasting change comes not from dramatic gestures but from consistent practice of fundamental principles. The techniques we've explored are not just personal development tools, they're technologies for creating more wisdom and compassion in the world. Every time we choose conscious response over unconscious reaction, we contribute to the healing of our fractured communities and confused culture. Every moment offers us the opportunity to practice these techniques. Every difficulty that arises can become an occasion for strengthening our emotional resilience. Every instance of chaos can become a chance to demonstrate that inner stability is possible regardless of external circumstances. The choice is always available, and it's always ours to make. We cannot control what happens to us, but we can always choose what happens within us. We cannot eliminate all difficulties from our lives, but we can transform our relationship to difficulty. We cannot control other people's emotions, but we can master our own. If these insights have resonated with you, consider subscribing for more practical applications of ancient wisdom to modern challenges. Share this exploration with someone who might benefit from these techniques. And most importantly, begin practicing these approaches in your own life. Start with small challenges and gradually build your capacity for handling larger ones. The path to emotional mastery is available to anyone willing to practice these ancient techniques with consistency and patience. The question is not whether you're capable of this transformation. The question is whether you're willing to begin. How will you use the next moment of emotional challenge as an opportunity to practice conscious response rather than unconscious reaction?